So this is now lesson 6 and is a new subsection of your first booklet B1.1 on cells and cell processes. This subsection is all about the movement of substances through a cell membrane, and there are 3 processes that you need to know at GCSE. They are described as diffusion, osmosis and active transport. In this lesson we're going to focus on diffusion. So the lesson objective today is to understand how substances move across cell membranes, particularly looking at diffusion in this first lesson. Back in year 7, you learnt about particles in the topic solid, liquid and gases, and how the particles are arranged and the properties of solids, liquids and gases. You also learnt that as particles receive heat energy, they start to move faster. So when they're arranged in a solid, the particles are fixed, but they can vibrate as they get heat energy. When they're arranged in a liquid, those particles have even more movement. And when they're in a gas, those particles are not joined together at all, and they have freedom of movement. As the temperature increases, those particles start to move even faster. So the definition of diffusion is molecules moving quickly at random, sometimes through a liquid or through a gas, and this is called diffusion. We say that those substances, those particles, move from a region where they are in high concentration, where there are lots of particles, to a region where they're in lower concentration, until they are evenly distributed. And you need to know this definition for the GCSE examinations. This definition is on page 32 in your booklets, and it might be wise to highlight this definition and to learn it for the exam. So chemical reactions that occur inside cells, such as photosynthesis and respiration, need certain substances, and these substances need to pass into and out of cells. So what kinds of substances might want to get into an animal cell? Well, if we think about respiration, the substances that are required in respiration are oxygen and glucose. Glucose is a type of sugar. So those substances will need to diffuse from outside the cell into the cell, from where they're high outside to where they're low inside. Question 2, what substances might want to get out of a cell? Well, in respiration, when respiration occurs, we get carbon dioxide and water are created. So carbon dioxide may want to leave the cell because an increase in carbon dioxide in the cell is not good for the cell, it's poisonous, toxic to it, and will pass out. And finally, question 3, the structure that these substances need to pass through to enter or leave is the cell membrane. Remember, the cell membrane is semi-permeable. We looked at the cell membrane at the start of the work on cells. So the cell membrane is what the gases and the substances pass through. So in this animation of diffusion, we can see there's more pink molecules on the left than on the right. And eventually the pink molecules move from where they were in high concentration on the left to where they were in low concentration on the right. So the pink molecules move from left to right until there are the same number on both sides. The orange molecules will move in the opposite direction. This is how substances such as oxygen and carbon dioxide enter and leave cells. And the line in the middle separating the two from the beginning, this represents the cell membrane. So we can see the overall flow of pink molecules is from left to right, even though you do occasionally get some of the pink molecules move in the opposite direction. The overall net movement is from left to right, and the orange molecules move from right to left. The overall net movement from right to left for the orange molecules. There will be a video towards the bottom of this Moodle lesson demonstrating this particular practical on potassium permanganate. Potassium permanganate is a really pretty dark purpley pink coloured liquid. And what you would do is take a beaker or a boiling tube of water, and you would take a pipette and very carefully suck up a few drops of potassium permanganate into the pipette, drying the outside and removing any of the potassium permanganate on the outside of the pipette, And then very carefully, you need steady hands for this, lowering it into the bottom of the beaker or the boiling tube and carefully squeezing out just a few drops of potassium permanganate at the bottom of the beaker. If you've done this correctly, you will just see a very dark purpley pink area at the bottom of the beaker. If we leave it for a while, after about 15 minutes, we can start to see the spread. And where it's concentrated, it's darker in colour, and we can see that as you move up the beaker or the boiling tube, it will get paler in colour. After about an hour, the potassium permanganate particles will have completely diffused throughout the water, and we say that that solution is now at equilibrium. In other words, those particles have moved from where they were high concentration to low until they are evenly spread. So watch the example of the video that shows the potassium permanganate. And then at the bottom of page 32, if you have a pink or purple coloured pencil, don't worry if you don't, any colour will do. Can you draw in, shade in into the beaker what it would look like after 15 minutes? So this diagram here, add to your beaker on page 32. There is also another video that is at the bottom of this link, and that's showing you diffusion, a very visual example of diffusion of hydrochloric acid, concentrated hydrochloric acid in the end of a glass tube on a piece of cotton wool, and at the other end of the glass tube, concentrated ammonium hydroxide. When these two chemicals start to diffuse along the tube towards one another, when they meet, they react, and you get ammonium chloride, which is a white, powdery, gassy kind of substance that appears as a ring, a circle in the middle of the glass tube. So please do watch those two practicals so that you have an awareness of them. Some examples of diffusion are not so easy to see. They're not so visual. Perfume diffusing, for example, is one of these things, okay? Or if you're walking past the King fish and chip shop, the lovely smell of the salt and vinegar wafting out of the shop and encouraging you to go in and buy some chips. We know diffusion is happening because we can smell it. Over the page, on page 33, you have a diagram with 3 boxes, just like this one on this page. There are 8 perfume particles in box number 1, and you can see they're all quite close together. They're touching one another. They're in a concentrated area. In other words, that's what the perfume particles look like when they're actually in the bottle. The moment we remove the lid from the perfume bottle, the particles start to vaporize. So the heat energy causes them to start to move. And so I want you to draw them in box 2 as they're starting to spread out and come out through the stopper of the perfume bottle, until in number 3, those perfume particles are evenly spread and you can smell it then as it's coming out of the bottle. The following factors affect the rate of diffusion. So we have things like the concentration. The larger the difference between the concentration of molecules, the faster they will diffuse. We sometimes call this the concentration gradient. So the greater the concentration gradient, the faster diffusion. When 2 concentrations are very similar, that actually slows diffusion down. The second thing that increases the rate of diffusion is temperature. On a hot day, that smell of the perfume will evaporate faster from the bottle, because the molecules have more energy, and so you will have faster diffusion of these molecules. You're more likely to smell it from a distance when the temperature is higher. And obviously the reverse, when it's cooler temperature, then it is much slower rate of diffusion of molecules. The third thing is pressure. The higher the pressure on the molecules, the faster the movement. So if we think about pumping up tyres on a bicycle or a car, the higher the pressure in your tyre, the faster these molecules are moving. And the last thing that would affect the rate of diffusion would be the distance that the substance has to travel across. And if this is through a cell membrane, if it's one layer, it will be much faster. If it's several layers of cell membranes that it's got to pass through, it's going to slow down the rate of diffusion. So if a cell membrane was totally permeable, this would mean it would allow everything in and out. A cell would die in no time. So even though the useful substances can enter the cell easily, the cell's contents would diffuse out too. So in order to survive, the cell membrane is what we call selectively permeable, and in some instances you'll read this in books and online as written as semi-permeable. Selective or semi-permeable membranes only allow some substances to enter and leave the cell. So we're going to look at two examples, an example of diffusion in animal cells and an example in plant cells. So your body cells need oxygen and glucose for respiration to release energy. These substances are carried in your blood, the oxygen from the lungs and the glucose from your small intestine. When the blood reaches the cells, the oxygen and glucose diffuses into the cells through the cell membrane. So we can see here this green arrow, oxygen going from the blood and glucose going from the blood into the cell. This is because they're going from high concentration to low concentration. They are used up very quickly in respiration inside the cell, so there is usually a lower concentration of oxygen and glucose inside the cell than outside. The cell then makes waste products like carbon dioxide in respiration and also a substance called urea, a waste product. These two substances, because they're high in concentration in the cells, will diffuse out and into the blood plasma. The carbon dioxide gets taken back to the lungs so that it can be breathed out, and the urea gets taken to the liver where it's turned into a substance that we can use, and then also to the kidney, okay, for removal from the body. So a couple of questions on page 33 in your booklet. What reaction requires oxygen and glucose inside body cells? Well, you should know that reaction is respiration, and our next booklet will concentrate on respiration and the respiratory system. Which cell organelle performs this function? Well, casting your mind back to the new cell organelles that we learned about at Key Stage 4, respiration happens inside your mitochondria in the cells. And the waste products that diffuse in the opposite direction are going to be carbon dioxide and urea and also some water. So here's an example of diffusion in plant cells. So you've already seen this cross-section through a plant cell leaf here, or through a plant leaf. And we can see the different layers. The diffusion of gases is very important in the leaves of the plant, particularly for photosynthesis during the day. So carbon dioxide is needed for photosynthesis in the daytime, and it has to be able to get inside the leaves, and it does this by coming in through those tiny little holes, those stoma that we talked about. So here's what they might look like on the surface, and this is a cross section. It does this by diffusion. So it's going to travel from where there's high carbon dioxide outside, where the carbon dioxide level is lower because it's being used up in photosynthesis, inside these spongy mesophyll cells, and then further into the palisade cells. Water vapour and oxygen that is made during photosynthesis will diffuse in the opposite direction. So because it's high in concentration during the daytime where it's been made, it's going to pass out. And this is really important for animals because plants provide us with the oxygen we need for respiration, and we provide them with the carbon dioxide they need for photosynthesis. So a couple of questions here. In the daytime, the stomata are open to allow which important gas to pass into the leaf for photosynthesis? That would be carbon dioxide. The two products made during photosynthesis that are released out through the stomata, it should actually only be one product, it's oxygen. But we also have water vapour. It's not made from photosynthesis, but it travels up through the plant. Water vapour will also leave out through the stomata. At night time, because it's dark, there's no photosynthesis. So at night time, the plant carries out respiration. And it will need to ensure that oxygen will pass into the cells in the leaf during the night time to carry out that respiration and to release energy. A couple of problem-solving questions just to finish off with in this lesson. If we look at the first two diagrams, the blue structure is supposed to represent a cell, and the outside of it is the cell membrane, and the red molecules are molecules that could be passing in or out of the cell. So if we look at diagram A, There are only 3 molecules outside the cell membrane, and there are many molecules inside. So you need to draw an arrow to show the direction those red molecules are going to move. So they're going to move from high to low, so your arrow should be coming out of the cell. But if we look at cell B, there are lots of molecules outside the cell membrane and only 2 molecules inside the cell. So this will be the opposite direction. We'll have these molecules moving into the cell until they are in equilibrium. The 3 circles underneath, it says use arrows to indicate the direction of diffusion of sugar molecules into or out of cells. So the higher the percentage, the more sugar molecules there are in the solution. So we've got in the first diagram 1% sugar inside the cell, 5% outside. So there's more outside, so the sugar will move in. So the arrow should be going into the cell. In this example, 3% inside, 1% outside. This sugar molecule should be diffusing out of the cell. And in this final example, we can see the percentage is the same inside and outside the cell. So we say that the solution is in equilibrium in and outside of the cell. So there is no net movement. There may be some molecules just moving in and out, but it will pretty much stay the same. It will be in equilibrium. The last task I want you to do is the homework on page 35. And in the diagrams, there are pairs of diagrams, and it wants you to say which pair will be the fastest diffusion rate and to explain why that will happen. And then next lesson, we're going to go on to osmosis. Thank you.